For sure. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My presentation is going to focus on the case for wetland conservation, as well as the state of wetland protection in Ontario. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Conservation and Education at Ontario Nature, which is a charitable conservation organization dedicated to the protection of wild species and wild spaces across Ontario through conservation, education, and public engagement. Established in 1931, we now represent more than 30,000 individual members and supporters and over 155 member groups scattered across the province, as you can see from the map on this slide. Next slide, please, Gabby. So there are many good reasons to conserve wetlands. They provide benefits which include refuges and movement corridors for wildlife, carbon storage, flood and erosion control, water purification, wild foods and medicines, and recreational and tourism opportunities. These benefits are critical at any time, but they're especially critical now, faced as we are with the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Next slide, please. The benefits that wetlands provide have significant economic value. One economic study commissioned by the provincial government conservatively estimated these benefits to be worth at least $51 billion per year in Southern Ontario alone. Another study released out of the University of Waterloo in 2021 estimated that the water purification benefits alone were worth $4.2 billion annually in Southern Ontario. And another study of specific relevance to the conversation this afternoon found that wetlands have a significant role to play in reducing flood damages and costs. Next slide, please. Given their immense value, it should be obvious why wetland conservation and restoration are so important, especially from a climate perspective. Beyond the primary and vital task of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, wetland conservation offers a complementary and cost-effective way to help mitigate and enhance our resilience to climate change. That's because wetlands help to sequester and store carbon, offer refuges for wildlife and movement corridors, and they help to control and mitigate flooding. And it's this last benefit that will be the focus of my presentation. As municipal leaders, you are no doubt more than aware of the major urban flooding events that have taken place over the last decade in Ontario, and their enormous cost to homeowners, governments, and taxpayers. As this slide indicates, urban flooding events are frequent and are taking place across the province, from Thunder Bay to Windsor to the GTA to Eastern Ontario. Next slide, please. The risk of urban flooding is increasing. The primary causes, according to Ontario's Auditor General, are the conversion of green space, such as wetlands, to impervious surfaces, inadequate or aging stormwater infrastructure, and climate change and increasingly frequent heavy rain events. Next slide, please. In this context of climate change and more frequent storms and flooding, it's easy to see why wetlands matter. Wetlands are nature's shock absorbers. Like big sponges, during storms they absorb much of the surface water runoff and then slowly release it. They moderate water flow, and they do it for free, while providing many other co-benefits at the same time. Next slide, please. The 2019 report of Ontario's Special Advisor on Flooding underlined the economic benefit of this role played by wetlands. They are, and I quote, cost-effective in reducing flood damages and associated costs. According to the report, maintaining wetlands can reduce flood damages and costs by 29% in rural areas and by 38% in urban areas. And I expect that you would agree that this is a significant economic benefit and one that should be factored into municipal decisions about land use. And here's another important point from the Auditor General's 2022 report. Even small wetlands matter. A wetland as small as 2 hectares can retain water runoff from an area 70 times its size, significantly reducing flood damage. We mustn't forget this, because small wetlands, especially in Southern Ontario, are the most at risk. A study from the University of Waterloo in 2022 found that small wetlands under 2 hectares in size are disappearing from the landscape at a disproportionate rate. That's because they usually don't qualify as provincially significant, And then, so they don't benefit from the protections that that designation confers. So they're the most likely to be destroyed and replaced by stormwater management ponds. And the trouble with that is that stormwater management ponds just don't provide the same suite of co-benefits, such as carbon storage and biodiversity conservation. And of course, stormwater management ponds aren't free. Next slide, please. Indeed, the cost of human-made stormwater infrastructure generally, including ponds, sewers, culverts, and so on, is a big problem in Ontario. A 2016 report by the Ontario's Auditor General highlighted this as distinct advantages of green infrastructure such as forests and wetlands compared to so-called gray human-made infrastructure. Green infrastructure was recognized as a powerful tool to manage stormwater, reduce costs, increase climate resilience, reduce combined sewer overflows, lower pollutant loads, mitigate flood risk, and recharge groundwater. So many, many benefits. That report also pointed out that there's a huge stormwater infrastructure deficit in Ontario, $6.8 billion in 2016. At that time, most municipalities were not fully recovering costs associated with stormwater management, and most did not have asset management plans for their stormwater infrastructure. Next slide, please. Given the many benefits that wetlands provide, including significant economic benefits, how have we been doing at maintaining them on the landscape? Not very well. More than 72% of wetlands in southern Ontario have been lost. And that loss continues despite policies and promises to halt and reverse wetland decline. Next slide, please. Recent provincial policy changes will make matters even worse. We're going to skip that slide, Gabby. I'm not sure you've got my most recent, but anyway, hopefully. Anyway, recent provincial policy changes will make matters even worse, and these include the overhaul of the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System, the diminished role of conservation authorities as a result of Bill 23, the Greenbelt land removals, the replacement of the provincial policy statement and the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and potentially the proposed provincial natural heritage offsetting policy. I'll just focus on the first and last of these points in my comments. Next slide. The changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System are extremely problematic, and that's because it will be much more difficult for wetlands to qualify as provincially significant, and many wetlands that currently qualify may lose that designation. And wetland protection, in most cases, rides on that designation. On top of this, the government of Ontario is removing itself from the wetland evaluation process altogether. And that likely means a bit of a free-for-all. Without the involvement of experts at the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to provide peer review of wetland evaluations, who is to say whether a wetland evaluation is valid or not? The likely upshot of these changes is that wetland losses will accelerate and intensify. Next slide, please. The other big policy change that I'm going to discuss is the proposed new natural heritage offsetting policy. This could be a really influential policy, and I'm concerned. That's because decades of research on and experience with biodiversity offsetting, especially wetland offsetting, have demonstrated that it is an extremely risky practice that seldom meets policy objectives or fully compensates for wetland loss and degradation. Next slide, please. A colleague of mine recently reminded me that wetland offsetting was very much like putting lipstick on a pig. So I think we have to ensure that we don't forget this. Next slide, please. Wetland offsetting involves restoring or creating new wetlands to compensate for harm to existing wetlands. It's a trade-off, and the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that it's a trade-off that usually results in loss for nature and for communities. Destruction is certain, and full reparation is extremely uncertain. Does that mean that we should just close the door and say no to offsetting? Well, it's not that simple. Unless we can realistically expect that there will be no more development allowed that harms wetlands, then there is a place for offsetting. If development is going to proceed regardless, then compensation through an offset is better than nothing, presumably. Next slide, please. What makes me and others especially nervous about offsetting, however, is that the promise of offsetting is often used as a reason to allow development to proceed. It's a slippery slope. And that means we really need to ensure that offsetting policies at all levels reflect high standards. Some of the key principles are listed on this slide: putting avoidance first, avoidance of harm first, aiming for net gain, affirmation of Indigenous rights, strict limits where offsetting is not appropriate, accounting for risk, uncertainty, and time lags, and designing offsets for the long term. Ontario Nature is in the process of finishing up a best practices guide to wetland offsetting policies for local planning authorities in Ontario. We expect to have it up on our website in a few weeks, and I'll work with Gabby to ensure everyone receives the link when it's ready. What I ask is that you consider sharing it with your colleagues on council and with relevant municipal staff. It's important that everyone has their eyes wide open if proceeding down the offsetting path. In the meantime, we have a new online primer on wetland offsetting available on our website, ontarionature.org. Among other things, it sets out a 10-point framework for evaluating and developing wetland policies. So if you have any questions or would like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at annbell@ontarionature.org. Next slide, please. And remember, at the end of the day, natural wetlands are best. We need to conserve them. Offsets rarely compensate for the damage done, and that applies to a whole range of values, including significantly carbon storage. Next slide, please. Thanks so much for your attention. And now for words of hope and inspiration about what can be done, I turn to Jacqueline Wilson from the Canadian Environmental Law Association.